before we get started, how many of you actually write Angular? Anybody writing AngularJS? It's okay, I won't make fun of you. Okay, I know. Been there, done that. It's going to be okay. All right, so this must be like the lone Angular developers at the conference, very .NET heavy place. And when I say you write JavaScript out loud, you might get some boo hisses. So today we're going to talk about Angular forms and how to manage them. And I wrote this talk after kind of getting pissed off at a situation where I was trying to implement a TypeAHead. I was like, it's 2019. I should not spend more than 5 minutes of my life trying to implement a TypeAHead, and was running into a lot of stupid problems. And so I kind of went down this pathway to discover a lot of things that are hidden inside of the Angular framework that you might not know about. So hope a lot of this content will be helpful. I'm open for questions, so if you have questions as we go, want to come talk to me afterwards, totally kill whatever floats your canoe. A little bit about me. My name is Jennifer Wadella. You can follow me on Twitter at @OMGIt'sFetty. I'm the lead Angular developer at a consulting company called Bitovi, so I do everything from working on client projects and helping them write better code to doing trainings and coaching all over the world. And I'm a big kombucha brewer when I'm at home. Does anybody drink kombucha? Yeah, kombucha people. It's awesome. I am from the United States, if you could not tell by my accent, and that little star is where I'm from. Because when I say Kansas City, people are like, oh, where's that? And then I have to explain, and it's a whole big thing. It's literally in the middle of the country. Everybody just flies over us between LA and New York City. But there is one really important thing to know about Kansas City, and that's our most valuable export, Paul Rudd. So, talking about forms, forms are how we get data on the web. So like, why the hell are they so damn complicated? It's completely obnoxious at times when you actually think about like the way web applications should work and just submitting data or figuring out ways to display ways to submit data to the user should not be that damn complicated. So the goal of this talk will be to make it a little less complicated, hopefully give you some nice little tricks and tips to manage Angular forms better. So when we talk about Angular forms, we've got two options today. You've got template-driven forms or you've got reactive forms. If you came from an AngularJS background like I did, template forms are going to feel really, really familiar with you because that's all that were there. Template-driven forms are going to use just the core forms module. We're going to use ngModel to bind our inputs. Should feel really, really familiar. Most of your logic resides in the template syntax. Which can be readable until you get into any sort of scenario where you need complex logic or dependency, and then it can get pretty ugly in a quick hurry. They're also asynchronous. So they're going to look something like this, where we might have a model, we might have a couple properties on that model, and we're using the ngModel directive to bind and get our information that way. Template-driven forms are great for a lot of very basic scenarios. Maybe you've got a simple login form, you've got an email, you've got a password, you've got a little bit of validation to let a user know what's going on. Not a big deal. Like template-driven forms, perfectly fine to use for those really basic form scenarios. The second you get into anything a little bit more complex, it's just, they get messy, they get nasty, and I find reactive forms to be a much more manageable approach. So when we talk about reactive forms, we're going to be using the reactive forms module, so it's a different module that you need to make sure you're importing. We're going to use the form control directive or a couple different variations of it to bind to our inputs. A lot of our logic we will have in our controller where we can start to take a little bit more of a reactive programming approach, and they tend to be synchronous. So it's going to look something like this. We've got a form, we've got an input, we've got that form control directive that is getting bound to our name property, and in there we've just instantiated a new form control using the Reactive Forms API. So, big fan of reactive forms. I deal with a lot of complicated, awkward form situations all the time, and reactive forms make me very, very happy. So, is everybody familiar? Is anybody familiar with reactive programming conceptually? Okay, is everybody like just fighting with TypeScript and RxJS trying to get through their day-to-day life as an Angular developer? My people, it's gonna be okay. This is the no shame room, by the way, no shaming. So let's talk, because for me, I felt like I really struggled with RxJS for a long time, and it's Angular is built on it, and you can kind of get away, but you can get into some ugly situations. But as soon as I really started to, at a fundamental level, understand reactive programming, things started to make a lot more sense to me, because before I was kind of like, why do I have to use RxJS? Why can't I just use Lodash? And so just understanding at a more conceptual level really, really helped me a lot. So I like to do a quick crash course just to get everybody somewhat on the same page. So when we're talking about reactive programming as a concept and the way we're managing things, it makes a little bit more sense. So we kind of have two styles of programming. We've got declarative programming, we've got imperative programming. So imperative is what you're probably used to, especially if you were a JavaScript developer who came up in the jQuery days. A user would interact with the DOM, you'd call a function, something would happen, and things could get messy really, really quick, and all of a sudden you're like, why the fuck is the CSS class being applied? Where is that coming from? So imperative programming is where some sort of event occurs, and then we run code that's going to change the state of the program. So user clicks on a button, we write some code, it's going to make a thing happen that may change the state of the program. But the problem is when we have all these different things happening, changing the state, it can be very hard to track what's going on and can be difficult to debug. Declarative, on the other hand, specifies how values should be generated. So when we talk about the state of an application, we want to say how a state should change and have kind of that as a single source of truth. So that way we're working with different inputs from the user or maybe logic on our end. There's one starting point where we're saying how state should be specified based on all these different things that may happen. So reactive programming is a style of declarative program that's more concerned with data streams and propagation of change. As front-end developers in an Angular world, we're dealing with two scenarios a lot of times. Maybe we're fetching data from an API or something like that, so we might be waiting on that call to complete. And we're also dealing with user interaction, whether a user is entering information in a form or some sort of thing. So when you just think about the nature of what we're doing by that, reactive programming starts to make a little more sense. And then RxJS is just a reactive programming JavaScript library, so a library written to help us reactively program better. So key concepts with reactive programming, kind of like our base thing is we have an observable, which is a lazy push collection of multiple values over time. So the idea here is it's something that we are going to create that we know will change or emit values over time. In order to get any of that information, we need to go ahead and subscribe to our observable, and I'll talk through a couple different ways that we do this in Angular. But it's important to know that until that subscription is created, you're not going to get any information from your observable. We also have a subject, special kind of observable. It can be multicasted to many observers. So there are times that dealing in a form situation, maybe we've got a couple different input fields and they're all going to be dependent on another input field and some specific kind of information. So that's where subjects can come into play. They can be multicast to all these different observers, and we can also publish and subscribe to them. We have a behavior subject, which is like a subject, but it will re-emit the last emitted value. So again, as we're dealing with form situations and we've got a bunch of logic happening where things are changing based on values or validation that might be happening, it can be really important to make sure that when we are creating a new subject that we're going to get the last emitted value, so it's not just sitting there null and we're like, okay, what's going on? Why am I not getting any information? And then we have operators, and so these are what we use to transform our observables. So if you are having to map through or filter through data, something like that, or maybe we are combining multiple sources of information. A pattern I end up using a lot is maybe I have a select dropdown, and I am waiting on, well, I have a service written and I'm going to return an observable from that, but then I also want to make sure that I'm getting interaction from a user to change that if needed. So we can start to deal with these multiple streams and merge them together, and again, have that one source of truth to define what we're working with our state. So we can create an observable. I've got kind of like a stupid little demo app set up. I'm very into, there's a drag race API based on RuPaul's Drag Race. So if you see random stuff like displayed queens, I'm talking about drag queens. That's the theme of this little application. Creating a profile as a Drag Race super fan. But we're going to have a service. It's going to basically fetch a list of all drag queens, and that's going to return an observable. To get this information, we are going to subscribe to that. My preferred method is to use the async pipe. So if you're not familiar, this is a pipe in Angular that essentially is going to subscribe to that observable, and then it's also going to handle the cleanup, the unsubscription when your component is torn down, so you don't have to worry about unsubscribing it yourself and create memory leaks. Also using operators. So here's an example where maybe I have a list of seasons of Drag Race that I'm getting, and I want to get a certain season based on an ID that I'm getting from an input. So I've got a list of seasons. I select a certain season, want to get that ID, and want to return that. These are kind of ways that we can use the merge map operator to combine these streams and return the results we want. All right, crash course over. Feeling okay? Nobody traumatized yet? Sweet. All right. Minimum trauma. Okay. So Reactive Forms, pretty basic API. Of course, if you're familiar with the Angular ecosystem, you know how big it is, and sometimes the documentation is not always the best inside of this ecosystem. So it can be hard to understand these very basic building blocks. So I like to go over, because a lot of times I'll see people searching for something on Stack Overflow, and they're like, how do I do this? And they're not quite paying attention enough to these building blocks, and then they're running into errors and not figuring out because they haven't figured out, oh, a form control class versus a form group class. So like to break down the basics because I feel like it makes everything way easier to handle. So basic building block is our form control. So this is what we use to create a radio, select, whatever. It does not care. This is simply going to take a piece of information that, you know, we presumably want to submit in sort of inside of a form, you know, post to an API, whatever. The form control is going to track not only the value, whatever that piece of information is, but the validation status as well. This is a very holistic talk. I'm not just talking about how to do forms, but how to also display them in a way that's very friendly and usable for our user. We're front-end developers. We care about the logic, but we also care about what the user is experiencing. So form control basic element. Let's say you are trying to build some sort of data structure that you want to submit. You can use a form group, which is essentially going to create an object of values. So we can have a form control, we can have form controls nested inside of a form group. That will create our object. We also have a form array. So I see a lot of people running into scenarios where they are dealing with very dynamic forms, and they have a need to be dynamically adding controls or removing controls, especially like repetitive ones. If you manage a Slack team, for instance, and you go to invite a bunch of different users, you might be giving in their name and email, and then you want to add more users, that kind of situation. How do we begin to dynamically add and remove form controls or form groups? So our form array will give us an array that we can push and pull from just like you would a normal array. We also have a form control name. This is a specific directive that ties to a form control inside of a form group. It's a getter syntax, so if we've got a group object and we want to call a nested key inside of there, we can use form control name. Don't want anybody to throw anyone. I use it all the time, so just want you to be familiar. And then we also have FormBuilder, and so this is a shorthand syntax for creating groups and arrays. Normally, if you were to create a form control, you'd say, you know, const name equals new form control, and you'd instantiate it that way. FormBuilder allows us to just have a shorthand syntax that just makes writing a lot faster. So form control is going to look something like this. I've got my form, which I have named. I'm instantiating a new form control. I'm passing in an initial value, and then I'm binding it with this just basic form control directive. So we'll see this a lot. That is creating a basic form control. Form group is going to look something like this, where we're using the form group directive to pass in our form group that I have created here. So I've got a new form group, and so inside of here I've got 3 different form controls, so that's going to represent an object with the keys first name, last name, email. So inside here, this is where I can start to use that form control directive name that I mentioned. Instead of, you may have seen this before, where you're calling form control and then you do myform.controls.myname or first name or whatever control you're looking for. Form control name is just a nice readable shorthand syntax that I like. Form array, so we might have something like this, where we maybe are creating a form that is going to take an invariable amount or a variable amount of users. So I'm instantiating a new form array, and then I'm passing it a form group object inside of here, first name, last name, email, second one here, and so I can continue to add form groups as much as I need to create that kind of situation. The tricky thing that you may run into is figuring out how to iterate through these, because obviously you don't know how many groups you might have. So here I'm using the form group directive to bind my main user form. So my next thing is it's going to be an array. So I'm going to go into the controls of that user form, and that's going to allow me to iterate through each of those form groups. So it's important to understand like what that control structure looks like. So we've got our user form. It's going to have a list of controls. Each one of those controls in this scenario is a form group. So I've named this user form group, so somebody coming behind me can read my code, understand what the fuck is going on. The important thing to remember here is we need to make sure that we're binding this nested form group again using our form group directive, and then we can use our form control name directive as intended to get our keys or our form controls inside of that group. Okay. All right. And then finally, FormBuilder, just so you are familiar with the syntax. So if ever you're debugging, you're running into problems because you copy-pasted some Stack Overflow code, because we've all been there, we've all done that, you will understand what's going on. So basically, we can inject the FormBuilder class, and then we can just have a shorthand where we type this .FormBuilder.array instead of that new form array, and then pass in some things. And then the real power here is you'll notice we're not even calling new form control. If we have a form group, we can automatically just pass in a key, and it's going to assume, okay, you're creating a form control. Pass it an array that's going to take some stuff. Tricky thing to know is you do need to make sure that you're not only passing a value, but the disabled status, or you can just run into some problematic behavior. So make sure you're instantiating your form controls with disabled set to false or true, regardless of whether you think you need it or not. Okay, so complicated problems. Let's talk through some things that you may have run into in the past or might run into in the future. First one, I need dynamic required fields. Pretty common scenario where we've got dependent logic going on and we're not quite sure how to handle marking those fields as required or not. If you're coming from a template-driven background, you'll remember like kind of putting that little required attribute on the HTML. But that can get really messy and really ugly to try and nest a bunch of if statements to handle that logic. So we'll handle that much more elegantly, in my opinion, using reactive forms. Needing custom validation rules. You're a bit above and beyond required. You need something to be required based on maybe the length or the amount or something like that. How do we begin to do that? Maybe you have run into a scenario where you're using a reactive form, but the problem is you want to display something in the UI that is not necessarily the same thing you want to submit as a value for your form. So how do we begin to handle that? I talked earlier about having to dynamically create and remove form controls, so we'll look through how to handle that. And finally, if you've ever had a very complex, robust form that you've wanted to nest across multiple components, or maybe you've got different routes that are kind of a step-through process of one whole cohesive form, what are some ways we can use to manage that? Because why'd we have to go and make things so complicated? It's just a damn form. If you want demo code, I've got this just working repo available here. A bunch of weird scattered scenarios going on in there. So if you ever just want something to look at, like I'm the kind of person that I like to download something that works and play with it and figure out what's going on, that's available for you there. Okay, so let's talk about dynamic required fields. And we'll look at my stupid app that I've built real quick. Okay, so this is my super Drag Race fan application, like MySpace for Drag Race fans. So I might have some sort of sign-up process. Is that readable-ish? Okay. So let's say this is the eventual data that I'm going to end up submitting. It's going to be a structure that looks a little bit like that for frame of reference. Got some information. I've got a nested address object that's got street, city, and state inside of it. I've got some random things. I've got a favorite lip syncs, which is an array that might take a variable amount of my favorite lip sync songs that have happened on Drag Race. So that's what we have going on here. And one of the first situations is dealing with if we want one field to be required dependent on another field. So in this case, that is this step where I've got some drop downs here, and I only want my episode drop down to be required if my season has a value. So how would I make that happen? Tracking? Yeah? Okay, ish. Drag Race knowledge is not required for this demo. All right, so I might have a form control or a form group that looks like this. where I have my select that has a form control tied to it, which is going to be favorite season, and then I've got my episode, and this is the form control that I want to be dependent. So I only want this form control to be required if my season, my favorite season form control has a value. Okay. So we initially have a form control that is unrequired. So we've got favorite episode here. I don't have any validators set on it. So this is kind of our starting point where I've built my form. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and subscribe to the value changes on my favorite season form control. So essentially I want to know anytime a user has interacted with that form control. Value changes is going to return an observable. So I'm going ahead and just subscribing to it in my component in this instance, and this is going to log out whatever that new value is that's been selected by that dropdown. So again, it's creating a subscription, and that means when you are tearing down your component, you need to make sure that you're unsubscribing to these value changes so you don't create memory leaks. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out figure out how to get the form control that I know I want to change, and then I'm going to use the SetValidators method on it. So here again, I'm listening to my favorite season form control. When that changes, I want to say, okay, let me go get my favorite episode form control, and I'm going to have that, and that's what I'm going to make changes to. So I can take that form control and I can use the SetValidators method on it and then go ahead and add validators.required, which is just the basic required validator. SetValidators, you can set any number of validators you want. You can set validators to null. One of the drawbacks to the Reactive Forms API right now is there's actually no way to get validators. So I've seen situations before that maybe you don't want to just wipe out all the validators. You want to figure out what's going on with those current validators and move on from there. There are a couple tricky workarounds, but no, you're not crazy. There's just literally not a get validators option in the Reactive Forms API right now. So back to the situation at hand, I'm going to say, okay, if there's a value, I want to go ahead and set my validators to be required. If there's not a value, like let's say the users remove that, I want to make sure that I'm clearing out that validator as well, because if the control, the favorite season control it's dependent on no longer has a value, I want to wipe that out. Another thing that people sometimes miss are forms have state. And so they have a valid state, and Angular is doing all this work under the hood to track the validity and update appropriate classes, whether it's been touched, whether it's pristine, whether it's dirty, that kind of thing. So it's important for us to make sure we're keeping everything in sync, and so there's this method called update value and validity. So basically that is going to assess the current state of the form control. It's going to be looking for if it has a value, whether it's required or not, and then do whatever changes it needs to make on the DOM. So let's say, for instance, that we had a form control and it was required and we had no content in there. And then we set content in there. What we would need to do is we need to call update value and validity to remove maybe that class that was styling to show that that form control was invalid. So if you ever get bored, like, sit down a glass of wine, dig through the abstract control API of Reactive Forms, you can find all this information. I spend way too much time on that page, but a whole bunch of methods that will blow your mind. Okay, what if you had a situation where maybe you've got this dependent form control right, and you are selecting a city from a state? You might want to go ahead and pre-populate information based on whatever that previous form control was. So we can use a set value method on our form control and pass in some sort of value. This is where you might be looking at this and being like, well, Jennifer, that seems like that could cause some side effects. That's not really reactive programming, is it? No, unfortunately, it is not. Reactive forms aren't 100% reactive programming, so you do need to be aware that you can be calling these methods and making this stuff happen, and that's much more hard to track down, but it's what we have for now. And if you follow the Angular community, there will be a new Reactive Forms API at some point, but there's not a listed date for that right now. But this is a way that you can programmatically set values or make changes to a form control. All right, so let's talk about validation, because this is something that I feel like a lot of people mess up. Angular provides so much good support under the hood, you probably don't even realize what's going on. So first of all, it's important to know that as Angular tracks the state of form controls, it sets all these different classes based on user interaction. So we've got a valid or an invalid class, and so that's going to, show the validity of the form control. So we'll talk about styling that. We also have dirty, touched, and untouched. So if you are dealing with a form control, a lot of times you'll not necessarily want to display something is invalid to the user until they've interacted with it, right? Like if you've ever logged into a form or like gone to start a form and they're all like blaring red and you're like, shut up form, I haven't even filled anything out yet, leave me alone. I think it's poor user experience, and you want to let the user know as they proceed through the form when something is invalid. So we can let Angular do the heavy lifting just by providing a couple styles here. Basically, what I tend to do is use the ngValid class if it's required, and then light that up as green when it's valid. And then if it's touched and it is invalid, then I want to go ahead and light it up as red. So meaning it will not show up until a user has touched or interacted with it. That touch class is going to come from interacting with an input. They have blur events built in. We'll look at an example in a minute where I'm kind of going to have to fake the blur event, because it's really important if you're building custom form controls to make sure they act as a way that a user would expect. Okay. So this also means if we're approaching this method where we only want to show form controls as invalid when they've been touched, what happens if a user hasn't touched anything and then try to save the form? What do we do? One of the things we can do is basically mark all those fields as touched on save. So a couple cool things. Angular 8, if you're on that version, they actually added a new method called mark all as touched, and so you can pass in a form group, and it'll go through all those child controls and mark them as touched. So yay if you're using Angular 8. If you're using anything below, you've got a little more work to do. You can basically just take your form, get all the controls, iterate through each of those controls, and each control by itself you can call mark as touched. So we're just skimming the surface of all the different methods that are available on the form control. They all inherit from the abstract control class, and have these different methods that you can use to manage pretty much any form situation. If it's not in there, if what you want to do is not in there, take a step back and think about if that's the way a form control should function, or you're going to create an accessibility nightmare and I will hunt you down and scold you. Okay. So now that we've had a little crash course about validation and styling, let's talk about custom validation rules. I've seen a lot of people come in, not realize that Angular has as much available, and then rewrite validation from scratch, and I'm like, oh my god, why? Angular does almost everything you could possibly ever need. So we have basic validation where we can import validators, and we've got several built in at our disposal. So required is the basic one you're going to use a lot. But we've got some other ones like email, because who doesn't love writing their own email regex? We've got min length, max length, min and max, required true, and then pattern, which I'll talk about. So all these different validators that are already there and ready for you to use. So if you are walking into a situation, you know you need some sort of validation scenario, double check the docs, make sure they haven't already done it, because that team is probably smarter than you or me. Okay. Pattern validation is really helpful to know how to do. This is where if you need a regex, let's say I want to test for a zip code and I want to make sure that it's only alphanumeric and 5 characters, I can pass in a pattern validator. So meaning if I type in ABC on this form control, it's going to be marked as valid until I give it 5 numbers. If you want to be a nice developer to your team who doesn't like regexes as much as you do, you can name them very politely and then pass that to your validator pattern so people know what's going on without crying themselves to sleep at night. Pro tip, your team will love you. So different ways that we can handle creating validation in patterns and regexes. So I use those quite a bit. And then if you are like, all right, Jennifer, what the fuck is going on? I always like to tell people about the regex crossword games. It's actually this really addicting puzzle that you can go and play and learn how to do regexes better. So it gives you these little, sorry, that's hard to see, these little scenarios that you can figure out what's going on. I distracted an entire team for like a good 2 hours one day at work showing them that. Fun times. All right. And finally, we have function validation. And so maybe you want to control your own logic where you have some sort of complex scenario. Maybe you have some sort of slider or range that you're wanting to set, and then you're wanting to get the value of that range and making sure your next input is inside of that range or something like that. That's how we can begin to write custom function validation and then pass that into our validators array the same we would from one of the validators already provided by Angular. Sweet. All right, so problem number 3. I need to display one thing in an input field for the user, but submit something else. A very likely use case, this is where I've run into it the most, is maybe you have reactive forms, you're using some sort of component library that has not been updated appropriately to interact with reactive forms. It's expecting an NG model or something like that. So how do we begin to deal with that? Has anybody heard of the control value accessor interface? Couple hands. Yeah? Is anybody scared by it? I'm going to unscare you. That's my favorite thing ever. All right, so Angular has something called the control value accessor interface. And so this defines an interface that acts as a bridge between the Angular Forms API and a native element in the DOM. So essentially, it's a way to create custom inputs that we want to act just as regular form controls. It's important to know that it's an interface, and so if you think back to interfaces in TypeScript, any methods or any members on an interface that are defined must be implemented in whatever is extending it. And then if it's marked by a question mark, that means it's optional. So we've got a couple things going on here that I'll talk through. The first thing to know is the right value method. And so this is the method that is going to be called in 2 different scenarios. One, when we instantiate our form control. So before, when I was typing new form control and passing in a value, right value will be called then with whatever that value is. And then as we modify our form control, if we call set value or patch value and give it a new value, right value will be called again. So we're using this to find out when our form control has been instantiated or changed, and then if we need to do something to reflect that change to the UI, that's what that is for. Register on change is that change event. So as we're tracking a user interacting with this custom component that we're going to be creating, when they've selected a value or the data or whatever information that we want to transmit to the form, we're going to call this register on change function. We also have our register on touch function. So we want to know when a user has interacted with a form control. So if they click on it or blur out of it, we want to go ahead and emit that event so the form is going to behave as expected. And then our optional method is set disabled state, and this is going to be similar to the right value. This is going to be called when a form control is instantiated with a disabled state, and then it's going to be called if that disabled state changes. So if we call .enable or .disable on our form control, this method will be called. So if you're creating a custom form control and you want to handle a scenario where it has a disabled state and a user cannot interact with it, that's how you will manage that. Okay, so the basic thing to understand here is the control value accessor interface is good for creating a custom component where you want really granular control of displaying one thing to the user in the user interface, but communicating something separate with your Forms API. So a couple things that I see people struggle with, they don't know where to put their validation or where they want to put their logic. Just think to yourself, all you're doing is creating a custom form control, and a form control has no knowledge about specific validation other than the validator that is passed to it. You just want to input and output form values and make sure that your validation logic and everything is going to behave as expected from the parent component or wherever that form is being created. Okay, so if we go back to an example problem, you might have seen this before. We have some sort of dropdown, and it's going to have an array of objects. We might want to display the name to the user that's human readable, but we want to submit the ID to our API. So how do we handle a situation when the library doesn't allow for that? For this one, I'm using NGX Bootstrap, which is where I first ran into this. And so if you're not familiar, it's just a basic component library, because who wants to rewrite all that stuff? So they've got a TypeAHead here. And basically, it is not set up to work with reactive forms. It's just using the old ng model syntax. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to wrap this input, let it function as expected with that ng model, but then use the control value accessor interface to then make it behave like a reactive or a form control that can operate in reactive forms. All right. So the first thing we need to do is do a bit of setup code, and so we're going to create this custom component. I'm calling it my TypeAHead component. And I'm going to provide the ng value accessor. This is going to register this component that we're creating as a value accessor in Angular, and use the forward ref to refer to the component itself, so it'll be ready for us to use. So some setup code there. The next thing we're going to do is when we implement the interface, again, because these different methods are required, we need to make sure that we're going to use them. So I am just setting up my change events, and then the write value event is going to be called when that form control is initialized or when the value of it changes. And so in this case, if you think about a form that maybe already has a value in a dropdown, we want to make sure that we're going to go ahead and select that dropdown again in the UI so it displays appropriately to the user. Okay. So our template is going to look something like this, where I can basically use whatever third-party component as expected inside of this component. I can use the ng model to bind this form control inside of there, because it's just going to do its own thing, and then it's not going to care about the eventual value that I'm emitting. So this is just some basic setup code where I am piping in that list of drag queens to this TypeAHead to list all those items. I've got my selected model, which is going to track whatever model I've chosen. And I've just got a template because instead of displaying object, I want to make sure I'm displaying the drag queen name, but then getting the value of the ID, which is what I care about submitting. I have a custom onSelect event here, and then I have a custom onBlur event here. And again, these are important because we want our form to be aware of when a form control has changed and when it's been touched or interacted with, so we can have all that state management done appropriately. So when it comes to using this in our form, the cool thing is we're not dealing with inputs or outputs or anything messy like that. We're just using the form control name directive, because as far as Angular is concerned at this point, this is no different than a regular input. So really nice, really clean way to create forms. So if we look at kind of what this looks like in my very random, messy, okay, so here I've, oh, sorry, that theme, can you see that okay? All right, I'm switching themes back and forth. So here you can see I've got my form group. Here's a basic input that I have that's just taking the form control name directive for whatever that might be. Here where I'm using my TypeAHead, I'm using it the exact same way, where I'm just using that form control name directive to bind my form control and just place it in my form like that. So really nice, really clean, really elegant. All right. So the cool thing about this is you can use the control value accessor to create reusable form elements instead of having to do the same input, output, event binding over and over and over again. So you can have really nice, if you're having to wrap a bunch of different third-party components, you can use those over and over and over again, and it's going to behave exactly as a form control. All right, problem number 4, I need to dynamically add and remove form controls and form groups. So we've got a situation here where I'll show you my little application where I want to select a few different lip syncs to list in my Drag Race Superfan profile. So I want to be able to dynamically add as many lip syncs as I want, but also remove in case I get a little too lip sync happy. So this is the kind of behavior that we're creating, dynamically adding and removing form controls. If we look at our data over here, if you can see that okay, this is basically, I'm just outputting the current form value and the validity state just so it's visual for y'all. But you can see as I'm adding these form groups, it's getting added to my form value. So that way you know what's going on. So the first thing we need to know is what our form array looks like, and so I'm using the FormBuilder syntax again. So I have a favorite lip syncs form control that is a form array. And inside of that array, I'm going to have any number of form groups. And each of those groups is going to have 2 keys. It's going to have a lipstick key, and it's going to have a lip sync, key and a ranking key. So whatever that lip sync is that I love, and my personal ranking for how awesome I think it is. For iterating through this in our markup, we're going to iterate through it the same way we looked at our form controls, but we need a couple things here. One, we need to track the index of the form control, which we will use for our removal method. So that's important to know, but again, this should feel familiar where we are using our form group directive to bind to that nested form group inside that form array. And then we are able to use our form control name to get that form control. In this, I'm just reusing that app TypeAHead component I showed you that I built for that other scenario to pull in my list of lip syncs. And then I've got two buttons here. One, I've got my add lip syncs button, and so anytime I want to add another form group to that form array, click that button. But then I also have a button to remove that lip sync, and I'm also passing it in the index of the form control. That's all we need for removing that. So for adding to the form, there on the form array there is an insert method, and so that is going to take basically an insert index, so wherever inside of that array, the index at which you want to insert it, and then whatever you want to insert, whether that's a form group, whether that's just a form control, or whether that's an array, depending on how crazy you're feeling that day. So I've seen people like try and maybe like just call a dot push because they think it's, you know, essentially just a JavaScript array. But the appropriate thing to do is to use the methods available on the form array class because that way your form will make sure that it's handling its validity and everything correctly. For removing from the form, we have a remove at method that's just going to take the index of whatever that item is that we want to remove. So pretty basic on how to use that, and so that's how you can begin to create those dynamic form controls. All right, problem number 5. This is a tricky one that I have gotten a lot of questions about lately and heard some interesting scenarios. So maybe you want parts of a form nested across components or routes. So if you look at my little sign up form that I have here, I've kind of highlighted it in ugly colors for you to see. I have this address that is a form group and it's got these properties inside of here. But maybe I'm going to have several different forms throughout my application and I want to reuse this kind of pattern where I have a group of form controls making up an address. Pretty common scenario, right? So what I am going to do is use something called the control container class. And this is a way to basically access multiple registered instances of ng control. And so we can use that to basically walk up our component tree and get access to those different forms. So in here I have a sample form that I have a first name and a last name, and then I have just this this child component called app address. And this is where I want to go ahead and be able to put my form controls for like street and city and state and zip. But I don't want to have to rewrite that. I want to just be able to use this one app address component over and over and over again. Well, if you're to try to do this with just having those form controls inside of that app address, you'll probably get an error like form control instance is not registered or something like that. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to inject the control container class. So here's what this markup might look like, where we have our address, our street, city, state, zip, form control names. We've got all that there. So if you were to do this as is, just like this, it's going to be trying to find this form or this state form control and not able to find it because it doesn't know what that initial form is. So we need to tell it what that is. So we can inject control container. And that's going to look for our control instances, and so we can actually get what our original form group is. And then we can use that in our form group directive and say, all right, Angular, this is my form. Now you can go and you can look for these specific form controls inside of that form group. So this will work across nested components. This will work across routes, a whole lot of different scenarios and situations for when you might have forms broken up across different ways, but you want one cohesive piece of information that you want to submit. All right, so a couple little tips and tricks that aren't very easy to find or figure out, but that can like cause some serious issues. There is, if you're essentially wanting to update a value on a form control, and you're also subscribing to a value on the form control, what do you think will happen if you're doing changes that are dependent based on that value updating? It can get really, really gross because if you're setting the value, well, that's going to create an observable or a new, it's going to call next on that observable. And so you're going to keep subscribing and then keep emitting new values, and it can get really, really bad. So you can actually, when you're calling modification methods like patch value or set value, you can pass in an option called emit event, and you can pass that in as false. So that will basically update the form value, but it won't dispatch an event that anything's listening for. So when I'm subscribing to value changes, that would not be called with the new value if you use emit event. So little tidbit for you there. Yep, and then I mentioned already, when you're initializing form controls using the FormBuilder syntax, you need to make sure to pass in the disabled status regardless of it's enabled or disabled, to make sure the form control behaves properly. So kind of summarizing everything that we talked about, reactive forms, yay, hopefully not so scary, and hopefully if you didn't have a good understanding of reactive programming, you have a little bit clearer of a picture of that approach. Custom requiredness and validation is actually kind of a breeze. There's a lot of really great built-in stuff to Angular already if you know how to use it properly. There's very little code you should have to write. The control value accessor solves any kind of form issue where you want to display something to a user and submit something else. You can have really good granular control over that. You can use the control container class to manage complex forms across components and across routes. So maybe forms aren't that complicated after this presentation. That's my hope anyway. Also, Avril Lavigne is timeless. Again, if you did not get it earlier, demo code is here. Just watching for cameras. Okay. And if you have any questions, raise a hand. Here's, if you want the slides for this, you can take a photo of that as well. But any questions? Any complicated situations I did not cover? All right. Well, I hope you have a lovely rest of the conference, you wonderful humans. If you have not gotten your PubConf tickets for Friday night, I would highly recommend going. It is a blast. It is a speaker competition. It is pretty off the wall, inappropriate, and hilarious, and all fun is to be had, especially because I was the champion from last year. So, sorry, not sorry. Have a great day.
Just on the way, we be fine ladies. He said he wants to know my name, 'cause I be African lady. And we they drive them crazy, or maybe J down to KD. And we they drive them crazy. Now all the DJs wanna play me, they wanna play Lady Dolly. Like I'm a stereo, they wanna finish on my money. I'm not gonna let it go. If don't say you know the story, yo, you know gonna let it go. Kana